Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to Secrets to Recovery Live. Secrets to Recovery Live, we like to explore different people's recovery stories, highlighting some of the different journeys, some of the different lessons that people have had on the path to recovery. And we really try to have a diversity of different backgrounds, different experiences, because everyone's journey to recovery is different. And my guest in the studio today is David Butcher. Now, David has had ME for a number of years, and we'll talk about his recovery story. He's also become chairman of the Optimum Health Clinic Foundation. So David's actually here in two capacities, partly his recovery story, partly also the work that he and the Board of Trustees are doing to support the Optimum Health Clinic moving forwards. So in the second part of today's interview, we're going to be talking about our very recent signing of a research agreement and how you can support the Optimum Health Clinic in doing a randomized controlled trial and the research that really we all want to happen. So David, firstly, welcome.
Well, thank you.
And we're going to talk about your recovery story to start with. And obviously, I'm aware of some of the story of how it started. But to give a bit of background to people, before you developed any symptoms of ME chronic fatigue, just paint a bit of a picture of your life kind of long before that, because you had a whole background as a CEO in the city, and just tell us a little bit about kind of your life before ME/CFS started.
I think the key point to make right at the start is that my personality is one of the fundamental issues here. Being, as you know, a high achiever, someone who's constantly pushing himself, relentlessly on to ever greater goals, And of course, that was my issue throughout my career. I did 37 years in financial services in the city. And in the last 5-6 years, I had a particularly demanding job, and I was just pushing myself far too hard, So you had that kind of cumulative stress building up from, insane objectives and insane bosses and insane toxic corporate politics and so on. So that's the kind of the first piece, really. That's the context,
And then I know you had a series of life events, let's say, which were extremely challenging. So, and that predated you having symptoms. So maybe just talk us a bit about kind of the beginning of that journey, let's say. And then how
I think in parallel to those years of high stress jobs, my father was suffering from Parkinson's disease for, I guess, 12, 13 years. My wife was also diagnosed with breast cancer in 2006, and I was caring for her for 4 years plus, and of course looking after our young daughter Charlotte at the time. So, and they both died. They both died within a few weeks of each other. So I had that, sort of double whammy of emotional trauma on top of the many years of cumulative stress from these crazy jobs. So that was the kind of second major element that laid the foundations for ME, chronic fatigue.
Yes, and of course, if we put it in the OHC model, big achiever pattern, but also big helper pattern, but also great demands on that helper pattern, which of course I know you did very, very lovingly and willingly, but nonetheless still a great demand, and also trauma in a sense, to be someone that you love, that you're caring for and supporting, and the kind of unfortunate kind of way it kind of unfolded.
I think that combination is lethal, really. The combination of the high achiever profile and the carer, because as the high achiever, you're constantly pushing yourself. Every day, every hour, you have a list of tasks that absolutely must be accomplished. So when you add that to the fact that you are caring for someone 24/7, and your own needs are just put on the side, you don't you never have any awareness even, let alone take any action about your own needs. You're constantly pushing yourself to care for this other person who happens to be dying. So, I think when you add that to, that stress, that emotional trauma, to the demanding jobs and years of cumulative stress, you've got two parts to what, for me, I think became the perfect storm for ME/CFS in the first place. The third part was my body was so beaten up, my immune system was so down, my nervous system was shot to pieces. I then caught a series of infections. So I then had an overdose of antibiotics. That went on to sort of 4 or 5 infections. And then I made the mistake of having the flu vaccination.
Right, right.
And I think that was probably the straw that broke the camel's back. So, job stress, high achiever patterns, emotional trauma, infections, that's it.
Yes.
The body then completely gave up.
And when you say your body completely gave up, like, was it a sudden thing, like one morning, or one day you woke up and suddenly you were just completely burnt out? Or was it a kind of gradual kind of sequence of things where you could just see you were getting weaker as time was going on?
I think it was a bit of both, though, because I was in that denial mode where, just pushing myself to get stuff done. I wasn't really that aware of it. I mean, with hindsight, I can see that there was a gradual build-up. But then there was a dramatic event, which was one evening. It was the 13th of February, 2012. I had to take my lovely young daughter, Charlotte, to A&E, and I was absolutely exhausted, and we were waiting in a waiting room for 5 hours before she could be seen, and there was nowhere for me to sit. And so I literally lay on the floor and I fell asleep, and I felt as though I got flu coming.
Right.
So when I got home that night, that was the beginning of the crash.
Yes. And how did the crash unfold from that point?
I was in bed for 6 weeks, so I was completely unable to do anything. I was totally depleted, absolutely no energy at all.
And this was how soon after your wife and your father had died?
I guess this was about 2 years afterwards. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So you had 6 weeks that you were completely wiped out. At that point, did you have any kind of diagnosis or awareness, or you just thought you had a virus, or how was it?
I didn't have any diagnosis. After a week of being completely depleted, barely able to crawl to the loo, and a shower and a shave were out of the question. There simply wasn't any energy at all. So I guess there was an awareness that something really serious was wrong, and I did start to do a little bit of research. And I guess 2 or 3 months later, when I was able to get up, I started that whole process of seeing GPs.
Right.
That, unfortunately,
which
in my
I'm aware
case,
was
soul-destroying process.
Yeah,
I saw 8 different GPs.
And one of the things that's really interesting about this is that a lot of people that we work with would go and see their GP and they wouldn't get the response that they're hoping for, and they would just go, well, that's all I'm going to get. But of course, with your tenacity, perseverance from your kind of previous life, let's say, you weren't willing to settle for, talk us through that, how you went through that sequence of events and what kind of drove and motivated that.
Well, I think the first thing was that I realized, probably a bit later than I should have done, that I wasn't getting anywhere with the 8 different GPs.
Okay.
But I was making, my starting point was the assumption that they must know something about this.
And what were they saying to you?
They were saying that the tiredness was caused by depression. So they're doing the classic GP thing.
Right.
They read you as being depressed,
yes,
and therefore the strategy is antidepressants.
Right.
After those 8 visits...
And just sorry to interrupt you, but
yep.
how did you feel when they were saying that? So you knew you weren't depressed.
Yeah.
How did...
I felt very frustrated. I felt angry. I guess I felt abandoned, really, by the NHS, because, as you well know, with that illness, you feel so lonely, you feel so isolated, and you're desperate for support of any kind at all. So a tremendous amount of frustration.
Yeah.
And the frustration actually only increased in the short term because apart from antidepressants, as you know, their strategy is cognitive behavioral therapy.
Yes.
Kind of implying that this entire situation is almost your fault.
Yeah. That's what it feels like. Yeah.
Which is what it feels like. Yeah. Followed by their graded exercise therapy, the GET system. And on both counts, really, I just got more and more frustrated and more angry. I saw 2 different cognitive behavioral therapists. And the issue there for me was that not so much that there isn't some great stuff in CBT theory, because I think there is, but the way it was practiced, the fact that they simply weren't in listening mode. They weren't interested in listening to my story, to my situation, to my symptoms even. They were simply applying their CBT disciplines, their box-ticking exercises, to this latest patient of theirs. Right. And, my history wasn't of any interest to them at all.
Which is very frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially when you've got the awareness to understand there's something else that's going on, that because the attention's being put here, there's other thing that's really going on is not being given attention and not being addressed.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you saw your 8 GPs and 2 CBT
Two
practitioners.
CBTs.
So and it's interesting because people often say, well, if only I had more resources. And of course, you were fortunate enough, you had the financial resources to go through these things.
Incredibly fortunate.
But still phenomenally frustrating that you're just hearing the same thing again and again and again. So, what happened next?
Well, the last part of the CBT process was doing the graded exercise therapy,
yes.
Which the second therapist I saw absolutely insisted upon. And I guess in a way it's kind of common sense, and I thought, well, okay, it is common sense, so I better do it. Mm-hmm. Of course, it was the worst possible thing to do at that time.
So what happened?
Well, I started doing the exercise regime, which was, to be fair, was gentle at first and building it up gradually over a few days. But because my body was so weak, because my mitochondria specifically were performing so poorly, it just led to another crash.
Right.
And so all I achieved was adding another 2 months to the recovery process to get back to where I was before.
Which is so frustrating when this is the people you're going to for help, and what's offered as help actually feels like it makes the situation worse.
That's right.
So where did that leave you? I mean, you'd gone down the traditional kind of paths, and what happened from there?
Well, by that stage, having got past that sort of major relapse triggered by the GET process, I had started to do a bit more research, and so I'd started buying books, I started doing a lot of reading, I was making notes, I was trying to analyse my symptoms and draw my own conclusions.
From your previous life.
I was using my business skills, exactly, in high achiever mode, though desperately trying to not push myself.
Yes.
So gradually I was developing a picture around ME and chronic fatigue, not really knowing about any nuances, any differences between those two. And then one day, and I have to give great tribute to my wonderful daughter Charlotte, she did some better research than I did, because I wasn't on the computer. I was buying books.
Offline,
I was offline.
Yeah.
Charlotte, of course, quite naturally started Googling, and she discovered the Optimum Health Clinic, and she discovered you. And she came home from school one day and she said, "Dad, I've got it. I've emailed the Optimum Health Clinic. I'm going to get a full information pack from them. You're going to get a video.
And it's
you're going to get a brochure.
It's 5 minutes walk down the road.
It's 5 minutes walk down the road. Plus, I found out there's this guy, Alex Howard, and I really think you should give him a call." Mm-hmm. And then, as you know, that's what happened. I booked a call with you, and then we started a whole different journey.
Yeah.
And the truth of the matter is that I probably wouldn't be here today, at least not with this energy and not with this full recovery, had it not been for the Optimum Health Clinic.
But it's interesting that, because I'm aware that prior to that, you also, and in kind of simultaneously when we were working together, you also saw a number of other medical people.
Yeah.
So just paint a bit more of a picture of, because I think it's interesting in terms of the scope of things that you explored and that you tried, of then what it came down to, the things that made the difference.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you said earlier on, I was incredibly fortunate because I had the financial resources.
Yes.
And so in that state of mind, money was not an issue to me. I would go and see anyone. And so I went to see 2 different private GPs in Harley Street who supposedly had an ME chronic fatigue expertise.
Okay.
I then went to see a functional medicine specialist and had a battery of tests done.
Many of which similar to which we do.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And they were the kind of precursor to the more comprehensive recovery strategy that I enjoyed here.
Yeah.
But what that did for me was to educate me about, looking at the body in, a functional way. Not saying, you've got cancer, therefore you need chemotherapy, or you've got autoimmune, therefore you need this drug.
Yeah.
It was basically looking at the entire environment of the patient, and so analysing the degree to which various systems in the body were not operating optimally.
Yes.
So this particular doctor was able to identify, a significant, underperformance in the adrenal glands, in the thyroid gland, in the mitochondria.
Which is also, just to kind of point out as well, you'd also, by this point, I think you've seen an endocrinologist, a gastroenterologist, so you'd also seen a lot of our other conventional medical people, which had all basically, after having a colonoscopy and all kinds of fairly invasive investigations, told you from memory there's basically nothing wrong with you. And then you start to look at it from a more functional perspective, and you started to get a real explanation of what was happening.
Well, that's right.
Is that right?
That's absolutely right. And what the process that I then went through was, I had this detailed analysis from a functional medicine perspective with tons of data, tons of numbers.
Yeah.
Because I hadn't had any prior experience of functional medicine, I then wanted to get a second opinion. So I went back to 3 different gastroenterologists for an alternative view of the digestive system. Mm-hmm. I went to an endocrinologist to get an alternative view of or a second opinion of the hormonal imbalances.
Yes.
And I went to a neurologist to try and get to the bottom of the mitochondrial issues. In other words, to give me a view as to whether all of this functional medicine stuff was actually accurate.
Yes. And of course, if I didn't know the answer, I could guess the answer. just for the audience watching, what was the response?
Well, there were 2 responses. The first response was, you're wasting your time pursuing the functional medicine route. This data that you're presenting me with doesn't tell me anything. The second thing was that after a further battery of tests with gastroenterologists, neurologists, and endocrinologists, it was impossible for me to look at the results that they came up with and make any comparison with the functional results, because it was apples and oranges. Right. It was a different basis, different numbers. So that ended up being pretty much a complete waste of time and money.
Yeah.
But the view that I came to through this part of the journey was that the functional medicine tests really were giving me valuable data.
Yes.
Now,
and we should just say, sorry, that for people that are watching, that functional medicine is basically the conceptual framework that underpins the nutritional approach that we use at the Optimum Health Clinic.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you were to go and see an endocrinologist and have your adrenals tested, if you didn't have Addison's disease at the extreme, they'd say they're functioning normally. A functional medicine practitioner or nutritional therapist would look at it and say, it may not be Addison's disease, but it could be suboptimal functioning. And that could actually be impacting on your body and symptoms in all kinds of ways. Yeah. So it's a different way of looking at the body.
Yes, absolutely.
Just to give context. For people that are
absolutely.
Yeah.
And the really interesting thing about the functional approach is that the functional medicine specialist is not interested in labels.
Right.
So ME/CFS or autoimmune, whatever it is, he's not thinking about that. What he's doing is he's analysing the entire environment of the patient holistically, and assessing the degree to which all of these different systems are underperforming or performing suboptimally. So in my case, for example, it became very clear that the adrenal glands, the thyroid gland, the mitochondria were pretty much shot to pieces.
Right.
I mean, the adrenal glands weren't as bad, weren't so far down the road as to suggest Addison's disease, but they were pretty far down the road.
Yeah.
But now that was all a great learning exercise, because when I came here, I was able to have all of those processes, ratified and confirmed, and developed a lot further. So the process I went through here became a lot more sophisticated. It was much more nuanced, and an entire nutritional strategy with the right supplements emerged from that.
Yes.
And I'm absolutely clear that the first and essential part of my recovery strategy that I got from the Optimum Health Clinic was that nutritional therapy piece, underpinned by functional medicine testing.
Yes.
Because out of that came, a terrific diet. I went on to a Stone Age, paleo diet with the right supplements.
Smiling.
Yes, I guess I was flashing back there rather quickly to some of the pain I went through, and it is pain, because the thing about this journey is that you have to be your own medical detective.
Right. And I think that one of the things that I think your story highlights so well is the potential when you really are driving your recovery in that way. And it's always difficult balancing that kind of achiever pattern, because people watching this may know I approach my recovery in a very similar way as well. And I would say in hindsight that kind of drivenness was the reason why I got better, and it's also the reason why I was ill, and it probably it accelerated recovery and it slowed it down, because I could be so obsessive about trying to work things out that caused its own set of anxieties. So of course balancing those things is really important.
Absolutely.
So,
and I think on that note, you really have to. The thing about the whole integrative medicine approach, from the Optimum Health Clinic, is that it's giving you the tools that your body needs for it to heal, but you play a critical part too, because psychologically you have to believe that you can recover. You have to own your recovery. You have to own every aspect of the process. You have to be patient. You have to do a lot of trial and error. You have to be able to be prepared to stop one part of your diet or stop one supplement and try something different, and maybe in different doses and at different times. And you have to develop a phasing strategy really with supplements and diet.
You have to be very patient with that process.
You've got to be incredibly patient, and you've got to be incredibly disciplined. And in that respect, I have to say I'm incredibly fortunate, because not only did I have the financial resources, but it's in my nature to be disciplined. And I've known others who suffer from this condition who don't have that same discipline. And that's why people need the support from the Optimum Health Clinic so much, because they get so much more of a framework of support to help them create that discipline.
Yeah, and we should also talk from a psychology perspective, because of course I worked with you on the psychology side, and the role that you feel that played, certainly in terms of calming the nervous system, maladaptive stress response. I don't know if you want to say anything about how that was for you. And sometimes people come in and initially there can be quite a lot of resistance to the psychology side, because it's like, especially when you've been to see people that have done things like CBT, and it's felt like they haven't really got it. So how was that whole?
Well, I think, to be fair, I was probably maybe a little bit skeptical at first before I started. But what I knew for sure was that because of my high achiever personality type, I've always suffered from anxiety. And I was aware from 20 years of meditation that I had this anxiety, stress-driven pattern of thinking.
Yes.
So I did have that awareness. And as soon as I started the sessions with you, I realized that the role for me of the psychology therapies was critical.
Yes.
And I would say that as the months of my recovery went by, I became more convinced and more clear that in my case, in particular, the psychology element was absolutely crucial.
Yes.
In fact, as my recovery progressed, and as I got better and better at listening to my body, I got to a point where I realized that in terms of my health and my healing generally, the physical side was well ahead of the psychological side.
Yes.
And I remember the point when I realized that the health was actually pretty optimal. I'd got my digestive system, my immune system pretty much back to normal. In fact, I'd probably argue that I'm healthier now than I have ever been.
Yes.
But the psychology side was lagging behind.
And you mean that in terms of being overstimulated in the nervous system? You mean that in terms of...
No, I think in my case it was particularly to do with anxiety.
Yes.
So, for example, I would have a thought about anything, the smallest thing, and a few seconds later, a little piece of anxiety would attach itself to that thought.
Got it.
And I had a bit of an epiphany while I was seeing you, and that was that...
I'm glad to hear it.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, I don't think I've told you this before, but the epiphany was to realize that, in my case in particular, it was essential to disconnect the anxiety from thoughts about how I was feeling physically. So what I mean by that specifically is, you have a day when you feel maybe you've overdone it. And you realize you've overdone it, and immediately you start worrying about that, because you start to think, oh my goodness, I've overdone it. How many days am I going to take to recover from that? I'm not going to be able to do the things that I need to do for my daughter in the ensuing days, And as soon as you have that little bit of anxiety, you get into a loop. The anxiety creates more tiredness. So it makes your physical symptoms that you had a very clear fix on prior to the anxiety, it makes those symptoms worse.
Totally.
And you just go around in a loop, and you get a bit more anxiety, and hey, presto, you feel more and more tired. And if you don't find a way of recognizing and being aware and managing and controlling that anxiety, then you just get worse.
Totally. It's absolutely right, and it goes the other way as well. That as you start to calm the body down, and the mind notices that the body, your symptoms are better, you're calmer, the mind calms, and so it's like you get a loop in either direction. And the more symptoms we get, the more we worry about, the more symptoms we get. That's how we can get lower and lower and lower. Yeah. As we start to reverse that, it has a very powerful impact.
Absolutely.
Especially if you can have a symptom and not have a reaction to the symptom. Yeah. So it's like, I've got a symptom, I've got leg pain, or I've got dizziness, or I've got fatigue. That's happening, but there's not a whole reaction feeding it afterwards. Yes. That's going to be a very powerful turning point.
Absolutely.
People. And it takes a lot of practice to learn to kind of change those responses.
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember also that you... one of the other qualities, you're talking about kind of like, supporting yourself in your own recovery path. You were very diligent in what you were doing, not just in terms of the kind of nutritional side and the patients and the kind of process with that, but also I remember when you started to get more energy and you started to go for little walks, and you used to live just up the road from the clinic here, and you used to kind of literally just walk a fraction further as you were able to. And it strikes me that it's not dissimilar to a graded exercise approach.
Exactly.
But the key thing was you were at the stage of recovery, you were ready to do that.
Correct.
And that's the whole thing that we have around different treatments work at different stages.
Exactly.
But it's really, I always felt that the way that you engaged with that had a patience and a kind of diligence, in a sense, to it, that you really controlled that achiever pattern, or you worked with, let's say. I don't know if you want to say anything about how you approach that, and just kind of, as you were getting stronger, not taking on too much too quickly, being patient, managing the setbacks.
Yeah. I think the key thing here really is awareness.
Okay.
And I think it's all about, it's listening to your body and getting a much better idea of exactly what you're capable of doing, mm-hmm. and realizing just how much the anxiety, when that pattern comes in, affects the whole process.
Yes.
And you're right, it was effectively a graded exercise program, but the key thing was the timing.
Right.
And combined with the awareness, because by that stage, I had much greater awareness and understanding of what I was capable of doing,
yes.
and the degree to which I would go over the edge and become newly exhausted if I pushed myself too much.
And you had the discipline to stop.
And I had the discipline. Yeah, I had the discipline.
Which is difficult.
And the discipline is incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And, this is a very, very difficult, lonely, and frankly tedious road, because, you don't have a life. Your life
is your recovery.
Your life is your recovery. There is no lightness. There are no breaks. There's no escape from that daily grinding reality of recovery. I think the other things that helped me in that stage of the recovery were yoga. Mm-hmm. I mentioned meditation earlier. I've done meditation for 20 or more years, and the yoga again. You had to pick the time to do the yoga.
Right.
The timing was critical.
Right.
But the meditation was a huge help, and sometimes I was doing meditation for 4 or 5 times a day.
Yeah.
I would do it immediately I got up for half an hour.
Yes.
2 or 3 times during the day, and another half an hour before going to sleep.
Yes.
All with the objective of trying to get some distance from my thoughts.
Right. And to calm the whole system down.
And to calm the whole system down.
Yeah.
And so, that takes, unfortunately, a tremendous amount of discipline.
Yeah.
And I think, just to go back to something earlier on about the psychology side, because I'd like to tell you about another epiphany.
2 epiphanies. You got your money's worth. That's good.
Well, one of the things that struck me after you had coached me, and after a lot of reading, was that what was going on essentially was that a shift in awareness or a shift in consciousness could create a shift in biology.
Right.
And I think that, for me at any rate, that was an unbelievably profound realization.
Sure.
And, when I had got to that stage in my recovery where I had fixed all my physical systems and I was concentrating on my head, realizing that shift in awareness could actually have an impact on, for example, my immune system. That was a breakthrough for me.
Yeah, and it's immensely empowering. What it also does is it takes away some of the fear of symptoms, because when we get symptoms and we recognize we can influence them, we're not so afraid of them.
Exactly.
Just coming to then, it's interesting because when you first came on board as a trustee, I remember the first trustees meeting. It was like, it was quite a big thing to come to a meeting for 2 hours and have the energy to kind of sustain that. And then we're, 18 months down the line from that, and being at the point where you're chairing a board of trustees, you're driving the agenda, and you have a very active social life. So, I know you consider yourself fully recovered at this point. But I don't know if you want to say anything about what it's like on the other side, kind of having come through it and looking back. And maybe also, at what point did you identify yourself as recovered? Like, what was the kind of point you went from someone who was recovering? Just,
I think the point of recovery is when I had that insight that the shift in awareness had a direct and immediate impact.
And you were recovered
on the
enough
shift.
That it could have that impact.
I was recovered enough to, exactly. Yeah. And it was the awareness to realize the very moment that I was disconnecting myself from that consciousness, that awareness, and slipping back into old pushing myself patterns.
Yes.
And then the third part of that is then the ability and the discipline to have absolute clarity about that, and then to slow oneself down and manage oneself.
Right.
And so I think, to answer your question about what it's like on the other side, it's actually a much better place than I've ever been in before, because not only have I fully recovered, and not only do I have fairly good levels of energy, but I have far, far greater awareness, and so I have much more control, in a kind of a mindfulness way, in the present moment way, of managing my energy and not pushing myself. And, spreading my workload, for example, and prioritizing all these things that,
you never would have done before, right?
Not so well.
Yeah.
I'm doing them much, much better.
Yeah. And we're going to come into a minute your role as chairman of the trustees and some of what's happening there. But maybe as a final question on your recovery path, when you look back on that journey, and especially maybe when you think about some of the lowest points at the start, especially then, I imagine being aware that you were a single parent and Charlotte lost her mum and now dad's ill. When you look back on that time, what advice would the you now give that you then? Or put another way, what advice would you give to someone who's in that place where they don't feel they're on the recovery path? What would you say?
I think I would, well, first of all, I would come to the Optimum Health Clinic. Because I think
you're biased, obviously.
I am biased, but it's also, from the heart, and it's absolutely true. I think the key thing is that awareness. Mm-hmm. Because, I came from a place where, as a high achiever, I guess I was pretty much in denial of what my needs were, even what my wants were, and of managing myself to ensure that those needs and wants were met.
Yes.
Because I was just pushing myself to do stuff in the world which actually wasn't anything to do with me as a person, me as a spiritual entity.
Yes.
So I think it's coming out of that kind of denial and getting to that level of awareness. That really is the secret.
Yeah, like accepting where you are and
absolutely.
You have to start from that point, however bad that point might feel at that time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the other thing that I would say is that, when I look back, I now see that those 3 terrible years of a horrible, horrible illness were a real gift.
Yeah.
Because without that journey, I would not have been able to go through this process of awareness and consciousness, and really kind of transforming not only who I am, but how I behave and how I think of myself.
And what you value to be important.
Absolutely. Yeah. So really that is, you get forced into these things in life. No one wants to have ME, chronic fatigue. But having survived that journey, I'm in a far better place. And so it really was an incredible gift.
Yeah. So let's come on to your role as chairman of the trustees. So maybe as a starting point to that, not everyone watching this may be aware that over 2 years ago, the Optimum Health Clinic became 100% owned by a registered charity, the Optimum Health Clinic Foundation, which means that all of the profits, or any of the profits generated by the trading companies, as it were, are directly invested into the research side of what we do. I don't know if you want to say anything, just to start with, about your role as chairman and briefly what the trustees do, like what that entity exists for, and then we'll come into the kind of the plans that we've got at this point.
Well, I guess there are 3 parts to my role. Mm-hmm. The first one is what is called governance, which in essence is ensuring that the charity and the clinic are well run and properly managed,
keeping me in check,
keeping you in check. No easy task. Ensuring that we're financially solvent. And of course, we're regulated. We're a regulated business. We're regulated by the Charity Commission. And so we have to run that business along very high, along lines of very high levels of integrity and professionalism and ethics. And so a key part of my job is ensuring that we do that, and that we comply with all of the regulations from the Charity Commission. And that is also what the Board of Trustees is, all about. As head, I have to make sure that all happens.
Yes.
But that's what the trustees are responsible for. So that's the first part of my role. The second part is being an ambassador and raising money, because, of course, our raison d'etre as a charity is to do research. We want to research, into the biological causes of ME/CFS. We want to do lots more research into the psychology side as well.
And of course, one of the things that I know you're very passionate about, having been in a position where you were fortunate enough to be able to afford the different treatments, the vast majority of people we work with are not in that position.
That's right.
And how do we take the treatments and the offerings that we have and make those accessible to everyone, not just those that are in a privileged position financially?
I mean, I'm acutely aware of how lucky I was to be able to afford private treatment, and not just the private treatment here, but I spent a small fortune on private treatment elsewhere. So I'm acutely aware of that, and that's why I'm so passionate about wanting to help other people.
Yeah.
And you did a survey last year that showed that 90% of the people out there within our community who did not pursue treatment with us were unable to do that purely because of cost.
Right.
And so that is why, our mission absolutely has to be to persuade the NHS to offer our integrative medicine treatments to all ME/CFS sufferers freely.
Yes.
So that's the mission. So to come back to your question, the second part of my role is raising funds for the research that we need to do in order to realise that mission.
Yes.
And I'll come on to the third part in a minute, but the research side really is why we exist as a charity.
Yes.
And we know that we know that this is a huge mission. We know that we've got an enormous hill to climb to get to that point where we can convince the NHS. But we've just made a tremendous leap forward, because we've signed an agreement with the University of Surrey, who will recruit a senior researcher who will carry out for us a full randomized controlled trial.
Yeah.
In other words, we will have ME/CFS patients referred to us from the NHS. They will go through our treatment strategies and our protocols. Those results, those evidence-based results, the science, if you like, will be accurately recorded following various guidelines and parameters. And then when we have all of that data, we will publish those results in a peer-reviewed medical journal. And then we'll have what we need to engage in discussions with the NHS.
And I think it's important to say, we had a study published about 2.5 years ago in the BMJ Open, which was in a sense the pilot study. This is the full Monty, in a sense. This is the piece that we need to be able to, as you say, go to the NHS, 3-4 years' time and say, this is the evidence behind what we do. And of course, as you and I know, that strategically it's more complicated than just doing a randomized controlled trial, but it's a fundamental piece of that. And it's a big step, and it's a big step to work with an organisation like University of Surrey, which have a very well-respected nutritional medicine department and a very well-respected psychology department. So for us, it's a perfect
very good
partner
fit.
in a sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, to do a randomised controlled trial, in the way that the NHS will require is going to cost us a lot of money.
Yeah.
So, if you like, the raison d'etre of the charity is research and fundraising in order to enable us to do that research, with the ultimate benefit
of your role. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And so it's very, very important that as chairman, I engage with individuals who are interested in ME/CFS, who have a relative who's had this terrible illness, to raise that money, and of course also engaging with charitable trusts and foundations. Yes. And that's the process that we've now got underway. We've recruited a terrific new fundraising trustee.
Who's also a recovering patient.
Who's a recovering patient as well.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a patient-led organisation. This organisation is led and populated by
trustees,
ME/CFS sufferers who've recovered.
Yeah.
So
it's worth saying with the randomised controlled trial that we're looking to raise over the next 3 years £275,000 to make the study happen. Now, some of that will come from profits from the Optimum Health Clinic, although I think it's worth saying that we don't run the Optimum Health Clinic where profit is the primary motive. We run it as patient care as a primary motive, but yes, we have to be commercially viable, and we make a little bit of profit. It's certainly not anything like what we'd love it to be, but we're more interested in taking care of our patients and supporting our staff, in a sense, in our kind of daily function. So we're also looking for people that are in a privileged position who are able to support us just by donating and supporting, but also those that perhaps don't have a lot of financial resources but do have time to potentially do little fundraising events or any way that they can support us in doing what we're doing.
Exactly.
I know that you and Catriona are leading, let's say, a little bit of a kind of mission to kind of inspire others to support us in that way.
Yeah, and there'll be lots of ideas coming out in the coming weeks.
Yes.
But if anyone who's watching this tonight, is interested in a little sponsored walk or a bike ride,
especially if someone's getting to the point they're recovering, it's a great way of celebrating recovery.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think psychologically that's a really satisfying thing to do.
Yeah, just not using your achiever patterns.
Yes, exactly. So Katrina Lennox is the lady to contact for all the support, all the logistical support and ideas for anything that our viewers want to try on our behalf.
Yeah,
which would be. And
just maybe then, in closing, where would you like us to be in 5 years' time? So we've completed the randomised controlled trial. What's all this about? What do you see as a kind of lead on the strategic side, or I guess co-lead on the strategic side? Where would you like to see that be?
I think where we would like to be is, first of all, we would like to have persuaded the NHS to offer the Optimum Health Clinic's integrative medicine treatments, to make those available as an option, as a choice, to all ME/CFS patients.
Yeah.
That's the first step. The second step is that we want to, I guess, change the nature of the conversation about ME/CFS within the ME/CFS community, within the broader medical community, and nationally. I feel, having been through the treatment process here, that the knowledge and the experience that we have from your 11 years of clinical experience, 11 years treating over 5,000 patients in 34 different countries. This is a unique collection of a unique pool of knowledge and data.
You'd have to be an idiot to see that many people not learn a few things about the condition.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I like to think we don't employ idiots.
Exactly. And I think there's a lot of knowledge and experience in there. I think there's a lot of attitudes and styles and philosophies that are not generally out there within the ME/CFS world. There's a lot of good things going on in the ME/CFS community, but I think we've got a lot of value to add to change the way the issue is approached, to change the understanding of the illness, to raise awareness of integrative medicine, to raise awareness for the illness itself. And so I think, to answer your question, the NHS offering the integrative medicine treatments and a different kind of debate, a different kind of awareness within the ME/CFS community, within the broader medical community, and nationally. We want to see these issues debated more fully in the national press. Yeah. And that's really the third part of my role, to kind of lead that, if you like, that public affairs and media relations strategy, and change the nature of the conversation, change the awareness.
Brilliant. David, I'm aware of time. There's so much more we could talk about. And
we could go on for hours.
We often do. No doubt we'll have you back on Secret Recovery Live at some point in the future. But for now, thank you. And also, publicly, how much I appreciate how much time you give. Of course, the trustees are all unpaid in their roles and give a great deal amount of time and energy to what they do. So I'm immensely grateful.
You're welcome.
And it's also, I think it's really nice for those watching to see the caliber of people that we have supporting. There's a kind of board of trustees behind the scenes that play a really, really fundamental role. And I'm very excited. There's a lot that's happened behind the scenes in the last 12, 18 months. And I'm very excited seeing some of this kind of come to the fore. And there's a lot more people are going to see over
Watch this space.
Time. Yeah, indeed. So, David, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Hugely appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And thank you for watching. If you'd like to find out more information on the Optimum Health Clinic, you can go to theoptimumhealthclinic.com. Our new website has literally just launched, so there's a lot more information about what we do. You can request a free information pack. You can also book a free 15-minute chat, which is a great way to find out more about hopefully how we can support you. But for now, thank you, David, and thank you for watching. Good night. Good job, Mr. Chairman.